Introduction. This is the second in a series of videos on the Opium Wars of the late 19th century, which were conflicts between Western powers and China, resulting from the sale of opium by Western merchants to Chinese traders. More specifically, the wars were military incursions by Britain and France aimed at compelling the Qing dynasty's government to lift its prohibition on the trafficking of opium to and within China in order to preserve the incredible profits being enjoyed by British and French companies. This video covers these topics. 1. Britain knew opium was addictive and harmful. 2. Most Chinese users were not addicts. 3. Opium legalization did not increase opium use. 4. Opium trading did not cause a silver crisis. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Britain knew opium was addictive and harmful. In this section, I will be relying heavily on the article Notions of Addiction in the Time of the First Opium War, published in 2015 by historian P. E. Kake. In this article, Kake notes, quote, "While most political historians have assumed that the British authorities understood the nature of the drug, social historians argue that notions of addiction only arose, in Britain, at the end of the 19th century. Kake observes that during the time of the Opium Wars, opium use was completely legal in Britain, where it was commonly used as a painkiller. Kake also notes that opium use in Britain was typically ingested as a pill or combined with wine to make a drug called laudanum, rather than smoked as it was in China. Most importantly for the topic of British attitudes to opium, Kake explains opium in Britain, quote, was sold widely and retailed not just by doctors and pharmacists, but in grocery stores, and its distribution was neither regulated nor subject to supervision." End quote. Dutch historian Frank de Kuyter writes that the British view of opium as a wholesome treatment for a wide range of sicknesses, quote, was only shaken with the emergence of medical science around the end of the 19th century. End quote. So, from this perspective, when the British sold opium in China, they were not selling a drug they believed to be harmful, dangerous, or even necessarily addictive. Instead, they were selling a compound they used themselves, and which they believed was a useful form of self-medication, significantly more beneficial and less harmful than alcohol. This would appear to mitigate the severity of Britain's opium exports to China. It could be argued that although the British were deliberately sending thousands of tons of opium to China, neither the merchants themselves nor the British government were aware of the drug's potential dangers. Consequently, they may have seen the Qing government's opposition to opium as merely pretentious moralizing, and seen themselves as the sellers of a relatively harmless compound which was both widely used and totally legal in Britain itself. However, there is substantial evidence that this is not true. A 2016 research paper by Dominic Budetti quotes the directors of the East India Company making a statement as early as 1817 saying, quote, "Were it possible to prevent the use of the drug altogether, except for the purpose of medicine, we would gladly do it in compassion to mankind." End quote. Clearly they were already aware that although opium had medicinal value, it could also be abused and was potentially harmful. Kake demonstrates even more clearly that by the time of the Second Opium War in particular, knowledge of opium's addictive and harmful properties was medically recognized, leading to considerable anti-opium sentiment within Britain. Kake quotes the book China, Its State and Prospects, written by British medical missionary W. H. Medhurst and published in 1838. Medhurst describes his observation of opium users in China, noting, quote, "When the habit is once formed, it grows," end quote, and more ominously, quote, "discontinuance is more and more difficult," end quote. This is both the language of addiction and withdrawal symptoms. Kake also quotes the book The Iniquities of the Opium Trade with China, written by British clergyman Algernon Sidney Thelwall and published in 1839. Although Thelwall was not a medical practitioner, he describes in detail his observations of British opium users developing a habitual usage of the drug, to the point that non-usage, quote, "is soon followed by a correspondent lassitude and intolerable depression which scarcely anything but a repetition of the dose can relieve." End quote. Thelwall writes powerfully of the opium user becoming, quote, "entirely enslaved to it," end quote, and of the strong necessity to ingest the drug regularly. Despite Thelwall's lack of medical analysis and knowledge, this is certainly the language of addiction. Though it may be tempting to dismiss these accounts as empty moralistic outrage from conservative Christians, Kake cites a range of sources giving the same warnings about opium, including the Foreign Quarterly Review, an independent journal in London, the Chinese Repository, a British missionary journal published in Guangzhou in China, and the Quarterly Review, a British literary and political journal in London. Articles in these publications indicate the addictive and harmful nature of opium was widely understood in Britain by 1840. Nor can it be argued that the British government was unaware of the potential dangers of opium. Kake quotes several sources from 1840 demonstrating that descriptions of opium's addictive nature and harmful withdrawal symptoms had become part of the political discourse over the First Opium War. An article in the political journal Morning Chronicle described the British opium trade as carrying, quote, "delirium and death and a moral plague," end quote. An author writing in the intellectual journal The Examiner supported the opium war in the service of British trade, but nevertheless took care to note, quote, "We think opium smoking a baneful habit, as bad as gin drinking, or perhaps rather worse," end quote. When the government's Foreign Secretary, Viscount Palmerston, was requested to support the opium war, he refused to defend what he described as, quote, "a trade which involved the violation of the municipal laws of the Chinese, and which furnished an enormously large population with the means of demoralization," end quote. Kake also quotes a British official to China who found it difficult to explain why the British government would not forbid the opium trade, but nevertheless described opium as both an evil and a cancer. One of the strongest proofs that the harmful effects of opium were well understood by the British government is the fact that the British merchants involved in the trade felt the need to try and launch a formal public defense of the drug. Kake describes how traders attempted to characterize opium as no more harmful than commonly used alcoholic beverages such as gin. The very fact that such a defense was made demonstrates that opium's reputation as both addictive and harmful was becoming very firmly established. Kake also writes that in 1839, the Jardine Matheson Trading Company, Britain's largest dealer in opium, led a team of other merchants to London to persuade the government to support the opium trade. According to Kake, these merchants expressed their willingness to spend any amount of money necessary in order to hire the relevant expertise to defend the reputation of opium against government critics. Such a desperate action demonstrates just how widely recognized and influential knowledge of opium's dangers had become, even by the time of the First Opium War. Over time, British opposition to opium grew at every level of society. The language of addiction, withdrawal, and personal degradation was increasingly used to stigmatize opium as both physically and morally dangerous. Medical practitioners also lent their weight to these arguments on the basis of their experience treating addicts. Finally, the British Poisons and Pharmacy Act of 1868, just 8 years after the Second Opium War, required all opium products in Britain to be labelled poison and restricted their sale so that they could only be purchased from registered pharmacists. At this point, there could be no remotely reasonable excuse for failing to acknowledge the addictive nature and physically debilitating effects of long-term opium abuse. Nevertheless, the British opium trade to China continued all the way up to the end of the 19th century. It can legitimately be stated, therefore, that British merchants were exporting opium to China for at least 60 years, despite the fact that both they and the government were fully aware it was an addictive and potentially harmful drug. Most users were not addicts. One of the most contested issues surrounding the Opium Wars is the extent to which opium sold by British merchants contributed to the rise of opium addiction in China. Liu et al. Claim, quote, by 1906, China had 13.5 million opioid addicts, who accounted for 27% of the adult male population, end quote. This is an extraordinarily high number, even if it isn't entirely attributable to opium sold by the British. However, there is good evidence that this figure is, at best, unreliable. At worst, it is a deliberate exaggeration for propaganda purposes. Despite the apparent authority of the statistics cited, their legitimacy is in fact entirely dependent on that problematic word addicts, a term with a far more elusive meaning. Were there really 13.5 million opioid addicts? What does addict mean in this context, and what indeed does opioid mean? Is this referring strictly to individuals who are psychologically or physiologically dependent on opium smoking? Or is it referring far more loosely to any individual who used regularly a product of which some quantity of opium was an active ingredient? Liu et al. Cite three sources for their claim. They cite Fong et al. 2006, who claim, quote, before the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, approximately 5% of the entire population of mainland of China, approximately 20 million people, were addicted to opium, end quote. But they do not provide a source. Liu et al. Also cite Lowinger, 1973, who claims, quote, by 1906 more than 15 million were addicted, end quote, citing a New York Times newspaper article dated 1924. Liu et al. Also cite Lowinger, 1977, who claims, again, quote, by 1906 more than 15 million were addicted, end quote, citing the same New York Times article dated 1924. So, Liu et al.'s addiction figures remain unsubstantiated. All we have here is one citation of Fong et al., who do not provide a source, and two citations of Lowinger, one in 1973, one in 1977, both times only citing the same source, a New York Times newspaper article dated 1924. Hardly a credible source. Consequently, we must look elsewhere for more reliable data. In this section, I will frequently cite the work of Dutch historian Frank de Kuyter, who co-authored with Lars Peter Laman and Chun Zhou. It should be acknowledged that de Kuyter, in the words of one reviewer of his work, quote, takes a strong stand with those opposed to restrictive drug laws, end quote, and consequently he could be regarded as potentially motivated to minimize historical evidence for opium addiction in China. As a result, when citing de Kuyter's bolder statements, I will substantiate them with evidence from other sources. Fortunately, de Kuyter et al. Are typically cautious with their sources, acknowledging, quote, the available statistical evidence is often contradictory, end quote. Still, they argue this evidence, quote, does not support the prevalent view that a majority of smokers lived in the grip of addiction and were compelled to take ever-increasing amounts of opium, end quote. Writing in 1995, historian R.K. Newman cautioned, quote, we must distinguish carefully between those who were addicted, those who were damaged in some way by the addiction, and the many millions of light and moderate consumers who were not addicted at all, end quote. This is supported independently by Youngwon, 2005, who writes that, quote, many, both rich and poor, enjoyed opium without becoming addicted, end quote. De Kuyter et al. Assert, quote, many smokers only took up the pipe on special occasions, end quote, also stating that many other smokers only used opium for medicinal purposes several times a year. They further argue that although opium was widely used, many people did not become regular users, claiming, quote, about 20% of men could be characterized as light or moderate smokers, end quote, while heavy or regular smokers, quote, constituted no more than 1% of the total population, or 5% of all recreational smokers, end quote. Newman likewise observed that some consumers of opium were satisfied with low doses and did not develop an addiction, noting, quote, this is particularly the case with smokable opium, the form in which the drug was normally used in Imperial China, end quote. He adds that even in the later 19th century there was, quote, a substantial body of evidence to show that small quantities of opium could be taken over a long period without leading to a craving, end quote. Dakota et al. Make a similar observation, noting that even two British opponents of opium, the medical missionaries Lockhart and Medhurst, quote, considered the use of 3.5 to 4 grams as smoked daily by many consumers to be entirely harmless, end quote, due to the fact that so much of the opium was consumed in the burning process rather than being ingested by the user. Dakota et al. Also make two important points about the opium smoking method in China. Firstly, they observed that local Chinese opium had a much lower morphine content than Indian opium, so Chinese users of domestic opium were much less likely to become addicted anyway, or at least it would take them far longer and far more opium to do so. Secondly, they note that smoking opium, which was overwhelmingly the preferred method of ingestion in China, produced a considerably weaker narcotic effect than eating it, which was popular in Britain. Dakota et al. Note that when smokers used opium, quote, 80 to 90% of the active compound was lost from fumes, which either escaped from the pipe or were exhaled unabsorbed, end quote. This meant that opium smokers in China needed to use far more of the drug than opium eaters in Britain in order to have the same effect. The difference in the volume of opium required by smokers means that even though a great deal of opium was being consumed in China, this doesn't necessarily indicate a very large number of addicts. Even casual smokers of opium who weren't addicted would need relatively large quantities of the drug in order to gain the desired effect. A further complication when attempting to assess opium consumption by actual users is the fact that a considerable amount of opium was used as a de facto currency in China and was imported specifically for this reason. Dr. Alejandra Irigoyen of the London School of Economics argues that the increase in apparent opium consumption during the 1820s, quote, was a byproduct of the cessation of the silver standard that had become popular beyond South China, end quote. Observing that the rise in imported opium did not precede the silver shortage but actually followed it, Irigoyen proposes that, quote, merchants turned to opium as a substitute for pesos, end quote, the silver coins China imported from Mexico, which represented a significant volume of the Qing dynasty's silver currency. This is a point to which we will return later when examining the Qing dynasty's apparent silver crisis in more detail. With regard to the harmful effects of opium smoking, Newman cites various studies on chandul, the specific combination of opium and water used by Chinese smokers, and concludes, quote, medical experiments with this form of the drug and with pure samples of its derivatives, heroin and morphine, have shown few, if any, harmful effects upon the human body, end quote. He also cites a 1987 medical reference work on drugs and drug abuse, saying this text, quote, confirms that in long-term heroin users, no marked physical deterioration or significant psychological impairment has been observed, end quote. Consequently, Dakota et al. Conclude that, quote, many occasional, intermittent, or moderate smokers may even have been unaware of any undesirable effects, end quote. Newman, assuming physical dependency on opium began at the lowest level of use, calculates generously that by 1879, quote, 8 million adult Chinese, or 2% of the total population, were dependent on the drug, end quote. This is at a time when 25,590 metric tons of opium was available in China a year, 2/3 of which was produced domestically in China itself, and only 1/3 of which was imported. Consequently, this is a surprisingly low number of opium addicts. Even if, as some statistics seem to indicate, opium consumption in China increased significantly after the Second Opium War, this would mean that the number of Chinese opium addicts in 1879 was larger, to at least some extent, than the number of addicts prior to and during the Opium Wars. Even if we simply assume that the figure did not change at all, this would mean that throughout the time when the British opium sales to China were at their height, only 2% of Chinese were addicted to opium. Although it's impossible to determine what percentage became addicted specifically as a result of opium imported from British merchants, again, even if we assume that every addict in China during the height of British opium sales was the direct product of the British opium trade, then we still end up with only 2% of China's population becoming addicted to opium as a direct result of British imports. Remember, this is taking absolutely the worst case scenario, starting with the weakest definition of addiction, using addiction figures from 1879, around 20 years after the height of British opium imports, assuming these figures represent accurately the number of addicts during the Opium Wars, and assuming absolutely every addict in China had become hooked by using British opium, not domestic opium produced in China. Even in this absolute worst case scenario, British opium imports only result in 2% of China's population becoming addicted to opium. This is not the typical Opium War narrative. It certainly isn't evidence that British opium imports resulted in a socially crippling epidemic of opium addiction in China. In fact, Newman turns the entire issue on its head, writing, quote, "It is not the existence of addiction that requires explanation, so much as the fact that, in a society in which opium was cheap and widely available, so many people smoked lightly or not at all." End quote. Opium legalization did not increase opium use. One of the most widely misunderstood consequences of the Opium Wars is the effect they had on actual opium consumption in China. This is illustrated dramatically in the historical work The Opium Wars, published in 2002 by historian William Haynes and journalist Frank Sanello, which provides a highly sensationalized account of the Opium Wars full of misrepresentations. First, the authors invite readers to imagine a Colombian cocaine cartel successfully fighting a war against the United States and forcing the government to legalize both cocaine use and cocaine imports. After describing this shocking scenario in some detail, Haynes and Sanello confidently assure their readers, quote, "A similar situation occurred not once but twice in China during the 19th century," end quote, claiming the British Empire, quote, "forced similar conditions on China," end quote. Unfortunately, their book is littered with dramatic chapter titles, sensationalized descriptions of the relevant history, and an extremely myopic account of the Opium Wars, which largely follows the Chinese government's traditional propagandistic narrative, taking little notice of either key primary sources or the dramatic change of perspective which mainstream scholars have adopted since the 1990s. In the words of one reviewer, Haynes and Sanello's work is, quote, "another hackneyed book filled with the same old stereotypes and biases about Chinese history and culture," end quote, with, quote, "little regard for or understanding of Chinese history," end quote. In the 62 pages of script I have written so far for this series of videos, I have cited Haynes and Sanello only twice with regard to statements of fact, and only when I was able to validate their statements with more reliable scholarly sources. I do not recommend their book. Contrary to popular belief, the Treaty of Nanjing, which was signed after the First Opium War, neither legalized opium use in China nor permitted British opium imports, and thus had no effect on opium consumption. The Convention of Beijing, which was signed after the Second Opium War, ratified the 1858 Treaty of Tianjin, which effectively legalized the trade of opium with foreign powers, such as Britain and America, but did not legalize domestic opium production or use in China. A significant complication when assessing opium consumption in China is that shortly after the Convention of Beijing, a large amount of opium was actually being smoked by Chinese producers of the drug. Historian Jonathan Spence cites early 20th century American economist John Lossing Buck, who spent some years in China providing a report on the country's agricultural system for the Republican Chinese government after the Qing dynasty fell. In the words of Spence, quote, "Buck found that peasants came to consume about a quarter of their own opium production themselves," end quote. Since the Indian opium supplied by British merchants was significantly more expensive than Chinese opium, it is understandable that most users in China were only able to afford locally produced opium rather than the foreign import. In their 2008 article, The Opium Wars, Opium Legalization and Opium Consumption in China, Chris Fager and Jeffrey Miron assessed the extent to which legalization affected exports to China as well as opium consumption in China. They conclude that, quote, after controlling for pre-existing trends, there is little effect of legalization on opium exports, end quote. And, quote, the results, therefore, provide no evidence that legalization increased opium consumption, end quote. However, they recognize it is possible that, quote, legalization caused a substitution from imported to domestic opium, at least after 1870, when China legalized domestic production, end quote. Consequently, they reviewed Indian export opium pricing to see if the price fell after legalization, which would suggest Chinese opium users were replacing Indian opium exported to China with domestic opium produced in China. After this further analysis, they note that after applying controls, the coefficient on legalization is, quote, insignificantly positive, end quote. Finally concluding, quote, there is no evidence, therefore, that legalization changed the path of export prices, end quote. At the end of their paper, Fager and Miron assert that, quote, China's legalization of opium in 1858 was not associated with a perceptible increase in opium consumption, end quote. However, they also describe several limitations of their research, such as the fact that it isn't a direct measurement of Chinese opium consumption and relies on opium import statistics. Nevertheless, they also point out, quote, the export data failed to provide even a hint that prohibition had reduced consumption, end quote. They follow this up with the observation that, quote, there is little evidence the Chinese government expended substantial resources attempting to enforce opium prohibition despite its ample rhetoric, end quote. This would suggest that the Chinese government's prohibition on opium really wasn't having much effect on consumption at all. Consequently, it does make sense that consumption levels remained more or less the same after opium was legalized. Opium trading did not cause a silver crisis. Liu et al. Repeat the common assertion that the opium trade was an economic danger which resulted in a silver shortage in the Qing dynasty, claiming that from 1800 to 1840, opium sales, quote, directly cost China at least 300 million silvers, end quote. They add the assertion, quote, the British opium trade was thus a financial drain and public health hazard for the Qing dynasty, end quote. This view is based largely on the estimates of Qing dynasty government officials who became greatly concerned with the apparent loss of silver caused by the opium trade. However, their estimates were wildly inaccurate. Julia Lovell writes, quote, panicked observers guessed that China's wealth had been reduced by 50%. The reality was probably around the 19% mark, end quote. She adds that it is, quote, far from clear that opium was exclusively to blame for the silver famine, end quote. In her 2021 book, Empire of Silver, A New Monetary History of China, Chinese economist and historian Jin Xu similarly cites China's wealth being reduced by 16.4%, quote, by conservative modern estimates, end quote. Xu also quotes Qing dynasty minister Wang Juesi expressing his concern to the emperor in 1838 that, quote, the silver is not spent in country but is leaking out to foreign countries, end quote, and his belief that this outflow was caused by British opium exports. Man Honglin similarly notes Qing-era commentators claimed, quote, the early 19th century silver outflow reduced China's wealth by 1/2, end quote, before citing the 19th century historian of China, H.B. Morse, who, quote, argued that the silver drain was only 7.4% of the total supply, end quote. However, Lin notes that although this view was commonly held by, quote, both Qing literati and modern scholars, end quote, Chinese economist Yu Kuei-zheng suggested that in fact there was, quote, a huge silver inflow into China between 1857 and 1886, end quote. Lin writes, quote, it is generally held that, beginning in the early 19th century, opium imports led to an outflow of silver, end quote, adding that this outflow is also commonly understood to have resulted in a silver crisis and the First Opium War. However, she challenges this narrative directly, writing, quote, opium imports were not the only factor behind the outflow, end quote, and, quote, exports played a major role in the evolving flow of silver and silver-copper coin exchange rates, end quote. Lin agrees that the Qing dynasty economy definitely saw a silver outflow during the 19th century, but argues it was not on the scale the Qing government estimated, and was caused by factors other than the opium trade. Lin explains the difficulties involved in estimating accurately the extent to which the Qing government was losing silver, writing, quote, there is no way to calculate the ratio between the $384 million in silver outflow and China's total money supply, end quote. However, she cites British parliamentary papers providing useful silver circulation estimates from the Maritime Customs records. After assessing this data, Lin concludes, quote, silver outflows between 1808 and 1856 would equal about 19% of China's silver supply around 1814, end quote, noting this is higher than Moore's estimation of around 8%, but much lower than the Qing dynasty's estimation of 50%. However, Lin further refines this figure with additional analysis, observing that the data from the British Maritime Customs, quote, overestimated the value of imports and underestimated the value of exports, end quote, adding, quote, when the proper adjustments are made, it turns out that during the period 1856 to 1886, China enjoyed a positive balance of payments, end quote. Consequently, Lin concludes, quote, the trend in opium imports did not coincide with the trend in silver movements in the late 19th century, end quote, challenging the proposal that opium imports were a significant causal factor in the Qing dynasty's silver outflow. Lin also observes that a rise in China exports of tea and silk between 1857 and 1886, quote, offset rising opium imports, end quote. Lin further notes, quote, the movement of silver back into China after 1853 to 56, end quote, was observed by British Maritime Customs officers, quoting a British commissioner who cited, quote, growing demand in other countries for the tea and silk of China, end quote, as a reason for the recent reversal of the previous silver outflow. At this point, it's important to note that although Lin's view that opium imports did not contribute to the Qing government's loss of silver is supported by a range of other scholars, her specific explanations as to why the silver flow was occurring have been challenged. In his 2020 paper, The Changing Significance of Latin American Silver in the Chinese Economy, 16th to 19th Centuries, Richard von Glan agrees that opium imports did not cause the silver shortage, but disagrees with Lin's thesis that the shortage was caused by a slump in global silver production and a reduced demand for Chinese exports. Although he acknowledges, quote, changes on the supply side also figured into the reversal of silver flows, end quote, von Glan says, quote, the chief reason for diminished silver imports between 1827 and 1857 was the Daoguang Depression, a protracted domestic economic crisis characterized by declining prices, real wages, land values, and trade, end quote. Von Glan also notes that the Chinese trade balance was restored in the early 1860s, even while British opium imports were still high, noting that this was caused largely by a combination of renewed demand for Chinese export products, Chinese domestic opium starting to replace imported Indian opium, and additional silver imported from Mexico. Xu likewise rejects the idea that Chinese silver outflow was caused by British opium imports, writing, quote, a drop in the production of American silver had an even greater effect on the great Qing Empire, end quote, citing Lin's thesis and pointing out how dependent China was on foreign silver imports. However, like Lin and von Glan, she also attributes the original silver outflow from China to a decline in global demand for Chinese products such as silk and tea at a time when British opium imports were increasing. After surveying the work of Lin and von Glan, Dr. Alejandra Irigoyen of the London School of Economics observes that both of their cases have merit and agrees that opium imports did not cause the Qing silver shortage. However, while agreeing with both Lin and von Glan that reduced silver imports were primarily responsible for the perceived silver crisis, Irigoyen argues that the real cause was, quote, the quality, not the quantity of the silver available in the world economy, end quote, in particular after the 1820s, before the British opium trade even reached high volumes. Irigoyen proposes the Qing dynasty's silver outflow, quote, was in fact the cause, not the consequence, of opium imports, end quote. Since China did not mint its own silver coinage, nor even use standardized silver ingots as a form of currency, it was heavily reliant on importing not raw silver, but actual silver coins, typically in the form of the Mexican silver peso known as the Carolus dollar or Spanish dollar, sometimes called a piece of eight. Incidentally, this is the silver piece of eight which has been popularized in pirate literature. The Chinese adopted this as a de facto currency because its value was already standardized and recognized internationally, making it an ideal coin for foreign trade. However, this made the Qing dynasty's economy highly vulnerable to the supply of this particular coin and its quality. Irigoyen writes that silver imports to China, quote, fell because after the mid-1820s, the quality of silver coins arriving to China became very uneven, not because there was a silver shortage at the supply side, end quote. He quotes a British consul writing in 1856 who not only observed the Chinese dependence on the Spanish dollar, but pointed out that, quote, production of these coins has long ago ceased, end quote. Once these coins were no longer available for import into China, the Qing dynasty was no longer able to replenish the only currency it used for purchasing imports. So the Qing government's real silver crisis was not a loss of access to actual silver, but a loss of access to the only coin it insisted on using for foreign trade. Once this supply of coins stopped, the government's existing supply of Spanish dollars was quickly depleted. Irigoyen explains that in the 1820s, a new Spanish coin emerged to replace the original Spanish dollar, but this was of inferior value and consequently, quote, confused the standard and aggravated the problem further, end quote. Attempts by Chinese officials to re-establish a standard by assessing, evaluating, and stamping the new silver coins to confirm their value proved hopelessly impractical, and Irigoyen says, quote, by the 1850s, the problem was acute, end quote. According to a British consul in 1856, quoted by Irigoyen, the Spanish dollar in China was, quote, now so scarce as to be wholly insufficient for the ordinary requirements of trade, end quote. Consequently, the consul concluded, the Qing government's actual silver crisis was a consequence, quote, almost entirely of the partiality of the Chinese for a scarce coin, end quote. Lacking the silver currency they typically used to pay for foreign imports, the Chinese needed another method of payment, and ironically, Irigoyen says, a considerable amount of opium was used as a de facto currency in China and was imported specifically for this reason. Irigoyen argues that the increase in apparent opium consumption during the 1820s, quote, was a byproduct of the cessation of the silver standard that had become popular beyond South China, end quote. This increase in opium imports didn't actually reflect an increase in demand by opium users or an increase in opium use, but reflected Qing dynasty officials' need for opium as a substitute currency for the silver coins that were in short supply. Substantiating Irigoyen's statement, Man Honglin observes that the British had the same problem. Since the Chinese required the British to purchase Chinese goods such as tea and silk with the same Spanish silver dollars, the British were also affected by the supply shortage. Noting, quote, the decline in silver dollars was highly correlated to the abrupt increase in opium imports, end quote, Lin writes, quote, the British could not find enough silver to pay for tea and silk and ended up using opium as the medium of exchange for them, end quote. So much of the increase in opium imports after 1821 was not the product of increased demand from Chinese opium users, but a byproduct of the shortage of the very specific Spanish silver coin, which Qing dynasty officials insisted was the only currency to be used for foreign trade. As soon as the global supply of that coin fell dramatically, both the British traders and Qing government were reduced to using opium as a de facto currency in order to replace it, which on the one hand required Qing officials to import more opium, and on the other hand required British traders to supply more opium. This increase in opium imports, therefore, was actually caused by the Qing government itself. Irigoyen explains that as the Second Federal Republic of Mexico became more politically stable, quote, the Mexican eagle dollar then offered, for the first time, a possible substitute, end quote. Subsequently, silver coin imports to China were renewed, and opium imports actually fell, while at the same time, quote, a serious effort at import substitution in opium production took off in China, end quote. As can be seen, the exact reasons for the Qing dynasty silver crisis are complex and multifactorial and continue to be re-examined in the scholarly literature. However, Vega and Miron represent the mainstream academic perspective when they write that although Qing officials wanted to blame the silver outflow on foreign opium imports, quote, there was no reason to believe the opium trade was the main reason for the silver famine or the recession, end quote. It's important to understand that the Qing government's shortage of Spanish silver dollars did not mean a lack of wealth. The Qing had plenty of wealth in other forms of metal currency and precious metal bullion. Additionally, other sources of silver were in supply if the government had wanted to import them, in the form of silver ingots, bullion, and even coins. But the government's unyielding preference for the Spanish silver dollar actually led them to reject these alternatives, as we have seen. To a very large extent, the Qing silver crisis was a problem of the government's own making and did not represent either a significant reduction of the empire's wealth or a lack of access to silver currency. As a final point, Xu observes that the Qing dynasty's temporary silver shortage actually benefited the government in the long term, writing, quote, if not for this outflow of silver, it is possible that China would not have been forced onto the road of modernization, end quote. Conclusion. This video has aimed to debunk a number of myths about the Chinese Opium Wars, demonstrating how the historical events have been misunderstood and misinterpreted. This video has focused primarily on examining the extent to which the British understood opium was addictive and potentially harmful, the extent of opium addiction in China during the time of the Opium Wars, the impact of opium legalization, and the reasons for the Qing dynasty's perceived silver shortage crisis. Opium's social, legal, and economic role in the Qing dynasty was complex and changed constantly, but by the mid-19th century, it had become an essential part of the economy. Historian James Spence writes that, quote, for at least the last 50 years of the 19th century, opium played an important role in the Chinese economy, end quote, citing its use as a de facto currency and the way taxes on foreign opium imports, quote, helped local officials meet taxation quotas, end quote. The third video in this series will focus on additional historical issues concerning opium in 19th century China which have been largely misunderstood, addressing these topics. 1. Opium was predominantly used for self-medication. 2. Government prohibition of opium caused social harm. 3. Government prohibition of opium was class warfare. 4. Chinese opium use declined for social and medical reasons. I hope you found this video of interest and that you'll view the next part of this series once it's released. Finally, many thanks to my generous patrons, Elias Asvig, Duran Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Sean A. Young, Andy Chaos, Tibby LTP, Thors, Niels Rethlin, Judge Sabo, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Martin T., Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Jack C., Ezekiel Stacey, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, and Dusty Bob. Thank you so much for your support, and please contact me if I ever pronounce your name